Hello and welcome to another season of Brewery Towns, the podcast that talks about brewing beer throughout the country. My name is Matt, and we are going to start this season off a little bit differently. We sat down with Tiah Edmunson-Morton, the curator of the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives at Oregon State University, and it was a real treat. We discussed the history of brewing beer in that state and how it got to the point that it is at today. As always, keep up with the latest news and episode releases on Facebook and Instagram at Brewery Towns, and also check out our new website, brewerytowns.com. And now, another episode of Brewery Towns.
This is the incomplete and things that I think are interesting story of Oregon beer. A little bit on hops. So this is the guide to the archives that I started in 2013, so almost 7 years ago. It'll be 7 years at the beginning of August. And when I started, I wanted to collect records that kind of complemented what we already had. And so we already had things related to science and hop research, just as part of the collections, special collections and archives of the library. So I started the archive and honestly didn't really know that much about Oregon beer history or farming history. I knew that seemed like a really great way to connect people to history though. So I started collecting by talking. So I talked to a lot of people, met a lot of people, and it's since then have acquired a lot of collection. And we have collections, like I said, related to the history of hops research and beer research at OSU, but also I've acquired collections like the Fred Eckert papers. The Widmer Brothers collection came in right before we shut down, so it's sitting on shelves. I'm kind of obsessed with thinking about it now. All I can think about is how much I want people to be able to use it, but nobody can come into the library, so there are other records related to the Oregon Brewers Guild and the Pink Boot Society and the Oregon Hop Growers Association. So lots of kind of professional organizations, but also records of companies and people. And like I said before, I started talking with my PowerPoint. I also have done a lot of oral histories. I counted before this interview. I've done 115 of them, which is sort of funny when I read transcripts as transcripts come into review, and I'm like, wow, I don't remember anything about that. Like, that's what a cool interview. Glad I did that.
And are those transcripts on the archives?
Yeah, so that's part of our summer project. So we have something called OHMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, and it's a product that comes it's like an oral history management product that's managed by the University of Kentucky. They have a really big oral history program there, and they released OHMS, I think maybe 8 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And you can have the transcript, so you have the video file, and then you have the transcript, and then you have you can do an index also or instead of a transcript. So we have students who work on indexing projects. It's a lot faster than transcribing. That's a long way of saying that on this guide that is up on the screen on the OVO Oral Histories tab, we're going to have all of the interviews that have OHMS entries linked straight from that guide. But we haven't done that yet. I would say maybe 15% of the interviews have transcripts, maybe 10%. It's definitely not as much as we'd like.
Transcribing is no fun.
The students get in, I have noticed, students get pretty into indexing. Like, I think indexing is easier for them, and it uses a different part of their brain, I think, than transcribing. Like, transcribing seems like it's more like you're an automaton. And indexing, I think, allows them to be a bit more creative, a little bit more thoughtful.
So you have students through Oregon State working with you?
Yeah, so right now, I have 2 graduate students who work with me, and they've worked with me they started spring term 2019, and I've had lots of interns because when you say, would you like to be an intern for a beer history archive, you get lots of yeses. There also just have been other students who are part of my department who need a project, and so that's the indexing is pretty nice because they can just drop into that if it's like a shorter term. I did just have a library school practicum student who finished up last week, and she was supposed to do, the entire thing was going to be to process collections, because I have a backlog of collections to be processed. And it was a 16-week practicum, and she got 2 days on site. So she did a lot of electronic records processing. So yeah, I get people who kind of pop in for projects or internships too, but usually I have at least one student who's dedicated to working with me.
So do you have objects too?
Kind of. I think that when I started the archive, I thought it would be more traditional, like stuff in folders. I was certain that breweries kept meeting minutes. Like I thought that was probably something that was pretty standard that they would do. So not so much. There are paper records, but then there are bottles, coasters. The Widmer collection has this really fun set of ephemera, like super fun ephemera, like lots and lots of tap handles. At one point, they sponsored a NASCAR car, and so there's like this little model of a NASCAR with like Widmer on the back. So there are some objects. I think the thing that really stood out to me when I started the archive, though, is that people who would be interested in this topic wanted to look at stuff. So they wanted to see things that were colorful, and they wanted to take pictures. And so I think the kind of material culture aspect of brewing was something that stood out to me that I never would have guessed would be something that would become a major facet of the collection. So there are labels, we have t-shirts, we have a cask from McMinimans, which is another Northwest brewery that is like a wooden cask, and they're really known for their art. We have the Pink Boot Society records, and Terry Farendorf started the Pink Boot Society, or took a trip in which she wore pink boots, and then ultimately it was called the Pink Boot Society. So we have Terry's Pink Boots. So stuff like that. We do have some objects. We have a few bottles of beer, like actual beer, which was a pretty funny conversation when we when I accessioned that, and one of our collections archivists said to me, "I just want to be clear. So are we archiving beer now?" And I was like, no, this is just a special case. And then the next time I was like, okay, this is a special case. So yeah, we just keep that.
Can the public see this, or is it just all online or through like private meetings?
Under normal circumstances, yes, the public can see it. Yeah, and like I said, a lot of people come by. It's a great thing for open houses. So I've done several open houses for family weekends, or our university turned 150 a couple years ago, and we did an open house for that. So there's a lot of just visually interesting stuff that's very colorful and really lends itself to public history, I think, in addition to that more kind of rigorous reading pieces of paper academic kind of history. I definitely have had quite a range of people who have used it. I think and honestly, over time, even over the past 7 years, there are a lot more people who are doing academic beer history scholarship and more contemporary academic beer history scholarship. So when I started, OBO was the only archive of its kind. Like there were corporate archives that had records related to the companies where those corporate archives were, and there were certainly beer history records in different places. It's not like they suddenly poofed out of nowhere, but I had no peers, essentially, even 7 years ago. So I think it's a field that's emerging and growing, which is, I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating to watch. It's not just that people want to look at pre-Prohibition 19th century German brewers, that now they are thinking about things like labor in the hop fields, or certainly this entire situation that we're in is going to rewrite the chapter of American beer, I think, in its entirety. I mean, I think this is, yeah. But initially, it was also, my work was really focused on the archive that I was building, or Oregon, and then kind of the Pacific Northwest. So certainly for hops, the Northwest is where it's at as far as main production. So I kind of thought about the Northwest and not just Oregon.
Do you think now that, I guess back when you started this, the Pacific Northwest was really leading the craft beer scene, do you think now that the rest of the country has kind of caught up, do you see more of these archives popping up?
I think that I don't know. It can feel a little chicken or egg. I think for the first, we got the Fred Eckert collection, I think in 2016. That was a big deal. Like, that was the first big, this is somebody who lots of people in the beer community know him. I had done an oral history with him, I think 2 years before, a year and a half before. And when he passed away, his papers came to us. And so I think that I did, I did a lot of talking when I first started, and I would present anywhere. I presented at old folks' homes. I presented at festivals. I presented one time, at a bar where, they just put a sheet up, and I broadcast my, presentation, and, the sheet was wrinkled because they just, taken it out and, put it up in front of the bottles that were behind the bar. So I literally would talk to anyone. And I mean, that honestly has not changed. I think it's fun to talk about, and so I'm still like that. I don't talk to as many rest homes as I used to, but I think I gave presentations at 3. So I talked a lot, and I think so. There was this growth in craft. And at the time that I started, Bridgeport and Widmer and Portland Brewing were the 3 main earliest historic breweries, and they were all still open. And they had, ownership had changed a little bit, but the Widmers is a great example of, they were part owned by Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch had I think 25% ownership. But I think when the Widmers retired, and then they fully sold now to Anheuser-Busch, I think because I had been talking and showing up so much, then it seemed like a really natural thing for the Widmers themselves to contact me and say, can you come get our stuff? I think they knew that as the company changed hands, and we went through, even before the COVID-19 shutdowns, we went through a really pretty terrible, bleak fall here in Oregon, and lots of breweries were closing. It felt like every week something was happening. And so Bridgeport closed, Widmer closed their tap room or their restaurant, Portland Brewing closed their tap room. So I think there was a lot of these really kind of foundational companies were either going through really, really major restructuring or closing entirely. I think it was good timing. I think my timing was good. And I think, part of what that good timing is that when I started, I think a lot of people were like, wait, who are you? What are you doing? What, do you just want free beer? I mean, it was that kind of are you a journalist? Are you a groupie? What's your deal, lady? And so I think now, like I said, people know who I am, and I think it's, they know that this archive exists and has been around for a long time, so I think there's kind of a credibility to it. I don't know that I actually answered your question. I think for me, it was also the benefit of being at a university that does this research. So I think there was kind of wrapped into that legitimacy and the popularity and really high quality of beer in the Northwest. I think it has been sort of good timing, but also a lot of other people who have done a lot of good work adjacent to me. Yeah. Nobody has asked me to do beer science experiments yet, so I'm sure.
Hopefully it's coming. Do you see a lot of brewers come in and use the archives?
We have had a couple. I know there's been more than one, but the one that I'm thinking about is there were a couple of guys who wanted to start a brewery, and so they kind of wanted to see what was happening again in the sort of early 1980s, that phase, they were curious if there was stuff related to like sort of decisions that they made, or even just thinking about how people were talking about it and where different breweries were opening. So we have things like guidebooks, that are super out of date. Like guidebooks are out of date the second that you print them, but these are from like 1990. So like they wanted to look at those kind of materials. I think more earlier on, the biggest users were journalists. I mean, you say that there's a beer archive at a university, and it's pretty flashy. Like it's something that people are like, what? So yeah, so lots of journalists early on. And journalists are it's very different than working with academics. I'm trying to think of other people that would be more kind of company sort of people. It feels now like it's sort of split between journalists and academics. The biggest shift, though, recently that's happened is there's this beer history class that started in winter of 2020, and there was one section of the beer history class. It maxed at like 49 students, I think, filled up, and the class was being taught by somebody who I knew, and he has done he did tastings and does beer tours and stuff, and so he is a historian as well. So he designed this course, and it's Mesopotamia to microbrews. So it's like the range of history. And I said, we have basically nothing about Egypt. Like we have basically nothing about labor unions and breweries. Like we just don't have it. What I did with my graduate student, Lance, and I made this beer research guide. And initially it was just going to be a class guide. Like that was the idea, is like I'll have some stuff about how to do library research. I'll have some stuff about some of the archives that I know. And then it just sort of like, it literally has taken on a life of its own. So this is the most recent iteration. We just added craft brewing as a tab today. So it's definitely, if you look at this tomorrow, it'll probably be different. But it became a really like sort of all-encompassing guide to doing beer research. A lot of the stuff was just, I didn't know how to do it. So I figured if I didn't know how to find statistics, then students probably wouldn't know how to find statistics. So I would figure it out, and then I would write it up, and then I would put it on the guide. It has definitely become more than just a student guide. Over spring term, so the university closed, went to remote only for finals week, and then spring break happened, and then spring term happened, so everyone had to flip their classes in a week. So a lot of that flipping over spring break, one of them was this beer research, or this beer history class, and it was going up to 2 sections. So it was 70 students in 2 sections. So I beefed this up, but then I started doing these scholar interviews, because again, I'm an archivist, I'm on the West Coast, I don't know a whole lot about how to do Irish history research. So I started doing these scholar interviews, and then throughout the term, as I would talk to students, I added more resources. I did a survey of the students at the end of the term, and they were like, we love this guide, there's too much on each tab. So now it's like, but then like each tab has to become more. So a couple days ago, I was researching how to research colonial beer cocktails. So that was like, I don't know anything about colonial beer cocktails. The shift, I think, of my work, even over the past 6 months or so, has really kind of focused on this class. There's another section, another class starts next week. There's a sprint course for the class, so 4 days a week for a month. And I'll do the same thing, like drop in and talk to them. But I think I am very happy to have this guide, because with a closed university and no collections for people to look at, and really it's hard for people to get books. I think that there's so much online content it was a stroke of luck that I did this over winter break for a winter class, not knowing what was coming. This class will have 3 sections fall term. Yeah, it will keep growing. But it's cool. I think it's made me certainly it's broadened my understanding about beer research.
Yeah, I think people are just like really hungry for this information. Now that I know of this, I'm going to use it for some of our episodes because, like you said, you have to just kind of go all over the place to get some of this stuff from the internet.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And I think one thing that, and I keep telling people, like, tell me if you want something else on it, because, like, I mean, I'm a librarian by training, so it warms my heart to just find lists of citations. Like, if I could just do that. Yeah, so this has definitely, it has taken over a bit of my life. The other thing that's taken over a bit of my life is the census. I'm obsessed with the census. And I was obsessed earlier on with newspapers, like historic newspapers. But I'm reading the census very slowly. I've read the 1850 census, the 1860 census, just for Oregon, not for the entire U.S. And now I'm reading the 1870 census. And that has informed a lot of the work that I have done as it relates to pre-Prohibition brewers. And I really, again, as a librarian and an archivist, I'm very, very frustrated by the mythology, in a way, of a lot of beer history. I think that's part of why I keep expanding this guide and deepening this guide, is because I want people to do really good scholarship around this, but it's a fun thing that's kind of flashy to talk about, but it's also, I don't want people to be sloppy about it. This is my daughter and my great-great-great-great-grandma, Euphemia Schrum. This is when we used to go places. Remember when we used to go and there were crowds of people?
Seems like so long ago.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. I'm like, oh my gosh, the people are just walking like there's nothing happening. So my family's been in Oregon for a long time. This is, like I said, my great-great, I think it's 5 grades, Grandma Euphemia Schrum, and she is the first in my direct line to come to Oregon. She came here in 1846, and her husband, John Edmondson, came here in 1850. And so my daughter is the first since Euphemia to not be born in Oregon. And she came here we came back when she was 9 months old. This is certainly, I knew that I was descended from people who had been here for a long time. I didn't know, or hadn't really kind of absorbed the meaning of this, is that my family, so I think it's her grandsons, grew hops. And I grew up in Eugene, which is about 45 minutes to an hour south of where I am now. So they grew hops in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were farmers, and they were farmers for a very long time. My parents still live within, 5 or 6 miles of where these people originally settled in Oregon, in the Eugene area. But farming had no role in my life. Like, my dad's dad died when he was in high school, and they sold the farm, and he became a journalist and then became a lawyer. And so, like, it was never a part of my life. But I think when I started the archive and started learning more, this kind of place became really important to me. This idea of place history became really important to me. And in many ways, I'm very unique, that there aren't a lot of people who are from here. There are some of us. But I think it occurred to me that this was very, it became very personal. So even though I do grow hops in my backyard, I can see them now from my window, which, normally at work, I can't see my hops from my window. I think I became very committed to the story of Oregon beer, kind of for personal reasons, and just that it's such a place-based thing. And so I think, you hear brewers talk about why they do what they do now, and it can be connected to this, like, the water is amazing. We do grow barley in the east side of the state, but, the main hop growing region is really very close to where I am, not in my backyard. Yeah, so I think the sort of story of this state, how alcohol came here, is really interesting. And I wrote this article for the Oregon Encyclopedia which fingers crossed will actually come out soon. It's been a year in the making. But one thing that they pushed me to learn more about, and I did over the past couple of months, is the kind of earlier fermentation or alcohol in this Oregon Territory area. So Oregon Territory went up into Washington. So we had this larger than just where the state was. Fur traders came over and were trading with Native Americans, and they traded something called Blue Ruin, which sounds terrible. I know it's distilled, so maybe it's a spirit. But there was this settlement. So the Oregon Territory was certainly settled and taken, and fur traders set up their outposts. Fort Vancouver was settled, and they imported beer and did have some. They had some ability. There's some evidence that they were making beer and thinking about distributing it as early as like the late 1820s. So 1829, there's a missionary who talks about beer and thinking about exporting it in a small quantity. But really until the state's population of white settlers really increases a lot in the 1850s. The places, the sort of Portland, Southern Oregon, some up along the coast, kind of where you would be near water. That's where a lot of the early settlements, the white settlers settled in Oregon. Hops and beer kind of arrived at the same time here. There wasn't like, one didn't lead to the other, and there's no evidence that it's like, oh, hops grow here, so let's make beer too. Like that doesn't, there doesn't seem to be any link there. I think not surprisingly, a lot of the early brewers were German, but there also were a lot of people, the early brewers who were from England and France and Switzerland. And I think part of that is just based on where country lines were drawn. So they could have, the people who were from Switzerland could also have been what is now Germany. So I think there's some, I don't want to make it sound like it was a really diverse crowd of Europeans. I think for the most part they were German.
Do you do any research into what the Native Americans might have been drinking?
I have not, and that's something that, again, I haven't quite figured out the corner to pull on that to figure out how to do that. I'm not quite sure. I know that just from the ingredients in the area, it was probably more likely that they were drinking spirits of some sort, just because apples grow here and pears. I don't know if you could make, in this area there was a lot of camas root, camas flowers, and I don't know if you could make beer out of that, or make a liquor out of that. Other things that would be here would be like, I almost feel like there would be styles that would be kind of similar to Finnish styles with like spruce tips or spruce beer. But yeah, that's one that I haven't. That was something that the Oregon Encyclopedia editors wanted me to know more about, and I was like, this article is already twice as long as you want it to be. Like, trust me, you do not want me doing more research. But that's one that I do want to know more about.
Yeah, just from doing our episodes, there's like really nothing online that talks about what they were drinking in certain regions.
Yeah, I feel like that would be one of those, like, I need to do a lot of pre-research to even know what it is that I'm looking for, you know? Like, I think that, yeah. The records, period, from that time, like, in the early Oregon Territory period, are not great. From, like, 1890, we start getting better about actually having, I don't know, maybe they disintegrated. It's so wet.
I'm surprised you even knew about the monastery that was attempting to make beer. I mean, that's pretty impressive in the 1820s.
Yeah, and I think it was, once the fort was settled, so there was Fort Vancouver, and there's one that's north. It was all part of the Hudson Bay Company. Like, they were settling along the coast, and so of course people needed to have alcohol because it's a long way to get stuff here from anywhere else. Yeah, I don't think they were making it in any quantity that would have been commercial, like I think there just weren't enough people, and they probably would have imported some spirits. I think that was probably easier to transport. Just knowing what the terrain is like here. But they did, once those brewers started to settle, early to mid 1850s, and once you started seeing newspaper ads are definitely the source for telling what kinds of styles. They were definitely making lager and steam beer. There are lots of ads for steam beer. They advertised making porter. One of my favorites is flat beer. So I don't know if they were making cask ale. I don't know what flat beer would be. Philadelphia Triple X Ale, Double X Cream, Triple X Ale. I had a student for a term who was trying to figure out if there was a Northwest style, an early Northwest style, because we weren't going to find any recipes. But if we could find a style, there was no. I mean, there were lots of styles. There was no Northwest Oregon early style, which it kind of makes sense. The places where settlement happened in the state were primarily in gold rush towns, logging communities. There were some urban areas that were kind of developing at the same time. So Portland was developing at the same time as Jacksonville was developing at the same time as Oregon City, which is where the Oregon Trail ended, and is really close to Portland. But it's really, really hard in Oregon to figure out how many breweries there were. And I think as somebody who wants, if I'm going to make historical fact statements, I want them to be very, very correct. And it's very frustrating that I can't be correct. So I can say with relative confidence that between 1854 and 1916, which is when we had Prohibition, that there were between 92 and 125 licensed breweries. But a lot of times the only evidence is an ad in a newspaper. So that's what this is an ad for Charles Barrett's Portland Brewery and Grocery Establishment. And he sold lots of things besides beer. And I'm curious, and I'm not entirely sure that I will ever be able to solve this particular riddle, whether he was actually brewing or not. I think that because he has titled it as a brewery, I think he probably was. I don't think there was no benefit to titling it as a brewery as opposed to a saloon. This general grocery establishment, though, there were different taxes paid based on whether if you had a grocery, you paid less in taxes. So there is a benefit to calling it a grocery. But he sold a lot of other stuff too. So he was selling merchandise. It's clear that he was selling merchandise for a town that at that time was, it was a port town. So people were going into Oregon up the coast, but also lots of transportation between San Francisco and Oregon, and Portland at this time. The southern coast of Oregon, there was a stop off there. So there were some breweries that grew there later. Reputed first brewer in Oregon was Henry Saxer in 1852, even though I'm not sure that he was even in Oregon then. So it's my favorite because I like to dispel those myths. But Barrett became a bookseller and was much more known for being a bookseller throughout his life. And he became really rich. And he had a daughter who ran the business with him. In the 1870 census, she's listed as being a bookseller, and he's listed as being a bookseller. And that's right before he died. I think he died in 1872. But she got married, and her husband left her and took her money. And she followed him to San Francisco and saw him drive by with his new girlfriend and shot him in the nether region, and went to what we call rich lady prison, which means that she just went for a little while, and then came back here and set up a school and was this sort of then rich redeemed woman. But it's a fascinating story. It's very salacious too, and so I like that.
Yeah, I like all the stories that come from all the offshoot stories that come from these breweries. It's almost more interesting than the breweries themselves.
And her name was something like Zarifra, and she was born in Peru, and they came from England and they stopped in Peru, and then they left her in Peru, and then at some point they had her sent up to California. I mean, it's just this very it sounds very salacious, very salacious. So Saxer is the first, the person that most people cite as being the first brewer in Oregon. I haven't actually found any original documentation that he opened in 1852. There were the Oregonian paper, I think, dates to like 1851 or 1852. There are no ads. This is the first ad, 1856, and he opened it with Louis Behrens, who he ran this brewery with him for a few years and then went down to Eugene. Louis Behrens went to Eugene and set up one of the first breweries in Eugene. Saxer moved to Idaho and then came back and opened a wine depot, and then his health was really terrible, and so he went back to Switzerland and died in Switzerland. But he and his wife had tons of property still in Portland. So when he died, his obituary was run in the papers here, and then there were, of course, lots of the state lawsuit things that were related to his wife having property here. But it's a frustrating thing to try to correct. It's definitely one, it's like my reason for being is to try to like tell everyone that Henry Saxer wasn't the first. But people don't want their stuff misspelled. So most of the breweries in Oregon were not big, which is not surprising. It's kind of a range. There were a lot that produced like 500 barrels. It certainly was the case that there were a lot of breweries or people who were identifying as brewers in the census records who were not owning and didn't have their names on breweries. So I'm not sure, again, how that fits into the records. Were they just identifying as brewers? Did they have companies that weren't recorded in licenses? Post-Prohibition, we certainly had a lot more restriction and tracking. Pre-Prohibition, not as much. So this kind of lower end 500 barrels in like the 1880s, that was a small amount.
And how much beer was in a barrel? Like, what's the quantity if you had to compare it to something? Yeah, I don't know either.
Like how many gallons, what the translation would be?
Right.
I feel like it's more than a keg. And there were a lot of coopers here. So there were coopers who were making barrels. It's hard to tell, though, honestly. I mean, there'll be pictures of barrels. If they're not in front of actual breweries, then I think barrels used for lots of stuff. I don't know if there's a standard size. Like, that's a good question. Like, if a pickle barrel is the same size as a beer barrel.
I was hoping if anyone would know, you would.
Oh, man. Now I want to know. Now I'm going to make a note.
Well, let me know if you find anything.
I will. So other breweries, though, had more higher production. So 3,000, 4,000, that was a pretty large production. They often would have a saloon. So you see the saloon. They also may have horse stables. They maybe would have a kiln. They might have an ice house. Usually they didn't have, most of the smaller breweries, like this Pacific Brewery, were, they wouldn't have bottling. Most of them, I think, were not bottling as an early, that wasn't part of what they were, what their deal was. They weren't transporting a lot, so it was a lot of local sales, probably in their saloon, but certainly throughout other restaurants or businesses in the towns. Oh, and this is a Sanborn map, which is like one of my, I don't love Sanborn maps like I love the census records because I love them visually, but they're also really hard to browse. Like you have to have a lot of patience to try to read Sanborn maps. But they can give you a lot of detail. We did a whole survey of how many ice houses there were and like whether there was any link between how big a brewery was and whether there was an ice house or whether they had adjacent ice houses. Yeah, so I love the Sanborn maps, and they'll just give you lots of really cool information about which businesses or whether there were houses next to breweries, which of course becomes a bigger deal when we start talking about prostitution and social hygiene and these concerns about vice and the location of breweries and drinking establishments. So here's some of these favorite titles, the Triple X Ale, the steam beer, you'll often see in ads information about who the owner is, usually not the brewer though. And this was something that was really surprising to me, is that the people who owned, for the most part, weren't the brewers. And so John Kopp, I think, was a brewer, but by this point there were other brewers who were making beer for the Pacific Brewery in Astoria. You'll also see stuff like where you can place orders. So if the brewery isn't open, you could place an order next door, or this kind of like language about all orders being promptly attended to. And it's sort of funny now to think about one way that Portland brewers during the shutdown, well, they're still shut down, but one of the ways that they made it was to do this kind of delivery. Like they were driving around and delivering to people. So it's this like, this stands out to me now in a way that it didn't when I gave this talk in February.
On this Mason's ad that we're looking at, it's interesting that it says ale, beer, and porter.
And Mason's is an option too, because Mason's was based in, the Mason Steam Brewery was based in California. So I'm not, I think they probably had, it's a company that I almost wonder, like, were they trying to reach different customers? Were they using the same language? Like, what was the sort of suggestion of Triple X Ale, beer and porter? Like, well, it meant something, you know, that they're selling this as extra fine steam beer, or, you know, that this was meaningful in a way that I think, unless we find diaries of people writing about the ads that they were reading, it's not really mentioned in articles about breweries. Like when they talk about breweries opening, they're not necessarily talking about describing what extra fine meant, or what the difference between a brewery that produced ale versus porter, like what that signified. I love ads. And again, the only way that we know what they were producing. Maltana. This is the sort of nod to Temperance Brew, and I'll have a bit more about how other breweries adapted, but I love this kind of marketing as a style. So this was 1908, so before Prohibition in Oregon. The North Pacific Brewery in Astoria was marketing this near beer, or this like version, Maltana. I love the ads. Guaranteed non-intoxicating, don't worry.
Everybody likes it, even the children.
Even the children. So Henry Weinhardt is definitely the biggest name in Oregon beer lore, and rightfully so. He was in a class of his own. His brewery was certainly way larger and produced way more and distributed way more than any other brewery in Oregon. He's an interesting guy, and I think, again, there's not a whole lot of hard evidence about him, and so it's people definitely reading what they want to into the stories about him and his work and his brewery, and the kind of implications, again, of he was part of the sin problem in Portland, and vice and prostitution and gambling. So he was born in Germany, came in 1852, and he learned how to brew in Stuttgart, and then kind of worked his way across the country. He lived in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri. He had a hiccup in Sacramento before coming up. It's clear he sailed up, and so it's clear that he had money. Like when he came from Ohio, he went down through Panama and up and around, and that, I think, was the people who did that definitely had extra money. So he came here with money. He came here with resources. He settled initially in Vancouver in 1856 and kind of bounced back and forth across the border. Part of it was that Fort Vancouver that I was talking about, where they were exploring their beer in the 1820s. He was set up in Vancouver, which is where Fort Vancouver was, to sell to soldiers there. And then, of course, when the Civil War started, a lot of soldiers moved away from Fort Vancouver, and so that was the time that he, again, was kind of bouncing back and forth across the border between Oregon and Washington. It was like every 6 months or so he bounced back and forth. which I guess is I don't know, it seems like a weird thing to move businesses, but I'm old and he wasn't, so. He married Louisa Wagenblast, and this is Louisa, and to say that I am obsessed with Louisa is like I have her picture on my desk. I regrettably do not actually have this portrait and this portrait. That's from his obituary, but there's one where he looks like that. These are two portraits that are they're stored at Portland Community College right now, and I was supposed to go pick them up like the week that everything shut down. So eventually, Louisa's portrait will be in the archives. But I wrote an article about Louisa. I also have emailed with her great-great-great-granddaughter, who didn't know what Louisa looked like. So it was kind of thrilling to be able to share this kind of personal history with somebody who didn't know a whole lot about the women in her family. It's definitely, the Weinhardt story is definitely a story of the men, and the women were really important in the success of the company, due in large part to who they married, honestly. Not because they were brewers, but they made some good matches. Louisa was also born in Germany, and she moved to Missouri in 1847 and came across her brother, her oldest brother. She was one of the youngest of 13 kids, I think. Her mom died when she was really young, and then half the family moved to to Missouri. And her brother came across the Oregon Trail with the guy who had settled the Aurora colony, which is this intentional religious community, but he wasn't part of it. He just came with them. So he came across on the Oregon Trail. She had something health-wise that prevented her. So again, they had enough money that she sailed up to Oregon. She is, I think, again, this sort of counter to the lore. And this is something that's really important, that these were family businesses, and it's important to complicate the story in my mind about how the involvement of women and what their role was in brewing. I think we want them to have been brewing, and there's not a whole lot of evidence of that. But she was really involved in her community, really involved in her church, really involved in early social services. And the reason that her portrait is at this building in Portland is because she donated the land and money to build a German old people's home, the Altenheim, and donated a lot of land so that they could have this German old people's home. And now they don't want to hang her picture because she looks too dour. That's what they told me, is that she makes the people feel bad. I'm like, she's just telling you not to screw off. She's quite stern.
So do you think, like the Weinhardts, was it Weinhardt Brewery?
It was he had partners at different stages, and then it was, I think in the early 1870s, 1870, 1871, that was when he became the sole proprietor. So it was the city brewery for a while, and then it became the Weinhardt Brewery. You can see, this is just 10 years apart, how the complexity and the span of this brewery. So they actually had, it's called the Brewery Blocks now in Portland, and he had operations on different blocks. It was so large, and their house was there too. They had a house that was just on the kind of other side of the brewery. It was huge. It was a huge operation. He died in 1904. His son-in-laws, he had two son-in-laws. One of them was a brewmaster, and the other was essentially the CFO. They merged with the Blitz Brewery and became Blitz Weinhardt. And the Wessinger family, so one of his son-in-laws was named Wessinger. The Wessinger family was involved until the brewery was shut down. It was sold to lots of different companies, and then Miller shut the facility down, bought it, and then shut it down in 1999. And so that whole area at that time was a very, very industrial, and it was a hard industrial area. Now it's very, very shishi. It's very, very fancy. There are things like there's a Madewell clothing store in the brewery, the block. There was a restaurant there that was in kind of near where the the big tower for the malt, where the malting happened, I think. And then they closed too. The restaurant closed, I think, like a year ago. There are still remnants. There is still Weinhardt, definitely. The area has changed a lot. And I don't think they will tear this down, but they definitely have added a lot of fancy shishi stuff around it.
Do you notice with a lot of the breweries, is it usually the last name of the owner? Or like, is it like City Brewery? Or the other one was like Liberty Brewery?
I think both. So I'm thinking about the early breweries, like, I think the Liberty Brewery was also called Saxer's Brewery. The City Brewery was also called Weinhardt's Brewery. So I think early on they would call something the City Brewery. Now, definitely not. Like, I think it would be, I mean, I guess the Widmers and I guess McMinimans. So I say definitely, and then like I give examples of how. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, if I think about those early, the Eagle Brewery was one in Jacksonville. Sometimes it would be named after cities, Roseburg Brewery, Bandon Brewery. And I guess the Astoria Brewery, the North Pacific, sort of is a location. It is on the North Pacific coast of Oregon. That's a good question, though. I wouldn't say always, I wouldn't say never. Transportation was something that I became really interested in the, like, why certain areas grew in terms of having numbers of breweries and why they didn't. So there were a lot of breweries that were very scattered in these small towns for a long time. And so I was trying to figure out whether that had to do with industry development or contraction, so like not having mining. There is evidence of the railroad certainly having a big impact on where railroad stops were. So as the railroad expanded, it came down the Willamette Valley, so Portland, Eugene, down into Ashland and into California and Sacramento, like those are all on the same line essentially. And so a lot of the kind of contraction of the industry, it really comes in much more into the Willamette Valley, and we still see that if you look at maps. If you exclude Bend, because Bend is its own, that is an outlier as far as Central Oregon beer is an outlier, but it's now pretty much concentrated on the western side of the state. But in the early years, like I said, they're down in Jacksonville and Southern Oregon along the kind of southwest coast. Heading into the southeast corner of Oregon, they were all industries that were pretty competitive with each other, or all areas that were pretty competitive. Once the railroad comes in, it changes everything. Breweries start getting a lot bigger. They start being able to transport their beer, not in horse-drawn carriages or wagons, but with actual trains with refrigerated cars. And so you see ice houses and ice stations being owned by breweries too, so that becomes another part of the business. They start selling things like supplies as well as beer. Proximity to railroad locations becomes something that's a selling point. The Columbia Brewery, which was in the Dalles, like the selling point was that you could get off the train and then go drink and then go get back on the train. Like that they were selling it as like a pit stop for people who were traveling on the train. So these networks really helped brewers move product, but it's also this sort of fascinating brewer network. So brewers moved around themselves, and Henry did that little jog across the border, but there were other brewers Godfrey Mayle is one that I think of, and he was in Roseburg and he was in Bandon. He traveled around that kind of South Coast area, settling in different places. So people they took their trade with them when they moved places. And a lot of these were family businesses. They either were there would be like a son would own a saloon and the dad would own a brewery, or like these were relatively small and family businesses. These are two of my favorite ladies, and they were married to brewers. woman on the left with the plant, that's Frederica Vetterer, and she had her obituary in the Oregonian. So she was one of the Jacksonville Brewers, or she was married to a brewer. He died. He left her super in debt. Her dad bailed her out, and then she married one of the brewer, and then they closed the brewery some years later. But she was a big enough deal that she had her obituary in the Portland paper. It is literally the worst picture of anyone that I've ever seen. So she's a lovely woman standing here with her plant. It was the first picture of one of these women that I found, and she looks like Iron Man. Like, she looks like, I'm like, where did you even get this picture? This is horrible. So not only is it like the worst picture, she also doesn't have her name. Her first name is not in her entire obituary. She is Mrs. Joseph Vetter, and then she's Mrs. William Healy. And that was part of the driving force of why I became really concerned about and interested in this, that, again, these were families, and women were running probably the business. They were also running the house. They were having involvement in the community. Yeah, they were involved in churches. The woman on the right with the parrots is also a terrific story. She ran the Grants Pass Brewery with her husband. Her name is Marie Kindlin. They moved here from Minnesota, set up this brewery, and they had tons of land. And he signed the brewery over to her and also signed all this land over to her. So they had lots of money. He died, and then she had to, so then like his wife and kids show up. So he had left his family in Minnesota and said that Marie was his wife. And so she had to pay his widow, who he was legally married to, $7,000, which in 1891, 1900s, I mean, it's a lot of money. So she paid the $7,000. There was one newspaper, I've never been able to actually confirm this, that said that she had a brewing degree from an East Coast, from the New York Brewers Association, which probably was like a correspondence course if she took it. It's like one of those things where someone's like, she had a brewing degree. And it's like, well, okay, like, where did you find that? She married Eugene Kindlin's nephew, who was 19 years younger than her. He left her, and she was very, very famous for walking around Grants Pass with these two parrots. So she would walk around downtown with these two parrots.
We hope you are enjoying our conversation with Tiah Edmunson-Morton, the curator of the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives at Oregon State University. If you like what you are listening to and would like to donate, please visit our new Patreon account at patreon.com/brewerytowns. You can join our monthly membership club or just give a one-time donation. We fully appreciate all the support that you guys have been giving us thus far. And now, back to the interview.
And they still do these like community reenactments where people pretend to be her, walk around with parrots. So these are two of my ladies, and they are certainly important to talk about, but also I think this kind of indicative of this time in Oregon as the cities are developing. There was no internet. There was no phone to call and say, wait, are these people actually married? They're saying that they're married. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about the way that the records and the kind of lack of record keeping at that time. But these yes, the parrots. This is a barrel. This is part of what I was thinking too. If like somebody sat on a barrel, how big would it be? So it's that big.
Smaller than I was imagining.
It wasn't a given that breweries had saloons, but a lot of them did have saloons. And this starts to play in to this concern about brewers and vice. So brewers, there was a profitability to having a contract with a saloon, but the problem was that sometimes the saloon owner owners then couldn't pay the contract. So they did this, they kind of slowly, brewers would just buy saloons. It was just better business for them to buy saloons. Often then they had some say in the saloon. So the German saloons were all reported as being really well lighted, and then the Irish saloons were the dark corners where there probably were prostitutes. And so there's this like, I think this interesting perspective on what is essentially the same thing. So they're still selling alcohol, but one seemed like a dangerous spot and one seemed like a less dangerous spot. Obviously, prostitution happened. It's not like prostitution didn't happen. There's not a whole lot of evidence, though, certainly in Portland, that prostitution was sort of happening in the same spot that the saloons was. I don't know, there's a whole lot of evidence that respectable women wouldn't go into saloons, and so any women who were there had to be women of ill repute. Yeah, so I think there's again a lot. I don't know tons about prostitution in Oregon, but they certainly are merged together in the language of the moral hygienists who were railing against any establishment that would welcome women, because certainly they were combination houses where you would buy alcohol on the floor, the bottom floor, and then go up and there would be prostitutes above. Like, certainly that's the only thing that could be happening. It's a sort of, again, another one of those threads that I would be interested in pulling more on, because I think there's a lot going on there about the opportunities that women had and didn't have, and the judgment of women who were single and had, sometimes had very young children and had to make a living doing lots of different things. So I think it's an interesting thing that has intersected certainly with my work. And so when I'm reading the census, I'm reading for brewers, but I'm also marking down every prostitute that I find. Or doubtful. Sometimes they're just called doubtful because, it's doubtful that they are pure women. Hops. Big deal here. And I feel like I always need to make my nod to hops. This is one of my favorite pictures ever because it's beautiful. It's a large, if you saw the entire thing, you would see this expanse of hop fields. This is from a hop field day, and it's part of the agricultural land grant university that you do research, and then you host these field days for farmers to come or for chemical company agents to come or whoever to come and ask questions about the research work. So I love this picture for that reason. I also love it because there's a woman wearing heels in a hop field walking with her black dress, and as someone who actually did try to wear heels in a hop field once, I can tell you that she's making a really good go of it. So hops are not something that are called out explicitly in advertisements or really connected, other than saying that something is a Bohemian hop, calling it out as extra refined because it's not from Oregon. Oregon certainly had more hops at this time than any other state in America. Hops and Prohibition is sort of an interesting time. So there were more hops grown in Oregon from 1922 to 1943. And kind of after the war, that's when the hops really start to move up to Washington. And then now, I think Idaho grows a decent amount more than we do here in Oregon. The time around Prohibition, there were a lot of hops that were grown here. It took a lot of labor, so there's a lot of really interesting, there are a lot of interesting records and a lot of interesting advertisements for pickers. They needed so many people that they were really diverse. It was a really diverse labor force. So there were pickers from the city, there were pickers from the sort of regional area of other farm workers. There were Chinese pickers. There were a handful of African American pickers. There were European pickers. During the war, during World War II, there were pickers who were POWs, and then there were pickers as the Japanese were put in internment camps. That's when the Brewers workers came up, and the Brewers workers started picking in the fields too. So it's this really sort of fascinating time to have such a robust hops industry because you couldn't make beer. So during World War I, of course, there was a lot of destruction of agriculture, and so most of the hops in Oregon were actually exported. But it was not illegal to grow hops, so any decrease in hops production during Prohibition was actually just because sometimes crops make more, or sometimes plants make more.
So what did they use them for during Prohibition? Who would buy them?
So they exported most of them. Most of them went to Europe. You can use hops for other stuff. I mean, people were also making alcohol, so it wasn't entirely dry, but most of them were exported. I mean, people would put them, like, they were pretty common to come out, like, when people settled here, they brought hops, and they would be just something that you would grow in your kitchen garden. Hops, like, when they start to come up, they look like kind of like little baby asparagus, and so people would eat those, that they would eat the early young shoots. The vines that grow, they're really, really, they're related to cannabis family, so they're related to hemp. The vines are really, really strong. Like, you can't pull them apart. So they would use them for rope. And then the cones themselves, I'm pointing like there are cones outside right now. The cones could be they were dried and put in pillows. They have some calming effects. They would make tinctures out of them, like hop oil, hop tinctures, hop bitters that would save everything about. I mean, it was like one of those catch-all, cure-all, like, but most of them were exported during Prohibition. So Prohibition came early to Oregon. There were local option laws. So Corvallis, where I am, went dry in 1904. But often in Oregon, I don't know if local options are unique to Oregon. I would assume not. The local option meant that you could have one town that was dry or one county that was dry, and then the town or the county next door was not. You often got these like one dry, one wet like areas. So Corvallis was dry, but Albany, which is like 10 miles away, was not. Eugene, where the U of O is, was dry, but Springfield, the town next door, was not. So there's this sort of fascinating, like, technically these communities were voting against having alcohol in their communities, but like then people would just go to the next town to get alcohol.
Just seems like you're losing business.
Yeah, they did weird things here. Like, they would, like, it was illegal to sell alcohol, so they would have these, like, subscription clubs. So they were, like, marketed to the young male students, and you could become a member of, like, a subscription club, and you paid your dues, and then you got to go drink there. But, like, technically you weren't buying alcohol, you were just paying for your subscription. So, yeah, people want their alcohol. But it definitely became, like I had sort of said over and over again, this connection between vice and prohibition and the story of statehood and the story of women's suffrage. It's definitely all intertwined in the same way that it is throughout much of the country. This photo that's on the right side is from 1915 and is of prominent temperance workers who had a stopover in Portland. They were on like a temperance train, and the woman who's looking at juice, so she's this concern that juice is being turned into alcohol, is Mrs. Jenny Kemp, and she was the Temperance League president. This was definitely it's a thing that makes me feel complicated inside, because I like being able to vote, but I also think this kind of early tie between prohibition and temperance. Certainly alcohol was destroying families. I don't know that prohibition was the thing that saved people and stopped all ill things from happening, but it is it's a big break for Oregon, and there are lots of these smaller breweries. The influence of the transportation networks, as the train came to certain places and didn't come to other places, that did start to have a kind of consolidation impact on the industry. But it's prohibition that wipes everything out. So when the larger facilities like Henry Weinhardt's or the Salem Brewing Association, they started to pivot. There were also, you could make denatured alcohol, so there were some breweries that started making denatured alcohol. The breweries that had ice houses started just selling ice. but it definitely, it wipes it out, completely wipes it out. The breweries that did survive, there were a couple of them. This is the Salem Brewers Association pivoted, and the Salem Brewers Association was owned by Leopold Schmidt, and he had breweries in Olympia and Salem and Bellingham. And he partnered with the Northwest Fruit Products in Salem and started marketing Loju, which was loganberry juice. I can't even imagine how many people made cocktails with this. Like, every time I see this, I think this sounds like a really good cocktail. They became the Fez company, and this ad is, I think, from 1918. October 1918. So what's happening? They're selling it as a cure or a product that you would need during a flu epidemic. So definitely you have beer companies really pivoting and trying to become healthy drink companies. Weinhardt started making Apo and Luxo. This is like this ad is super fascinating for lots of different reasons. So Weinhardt pivots to really being very focused on being pure. The plant down in the bottom where it says the Henry Weinhardt's plant, and you see what looks like a church steeple. Like, I don't know what that is. That's not near, like, that doesn't exist. That didn't exist. So it's this like we're now rebranding something that's very safe for children, that it's absolute purity, it's a safe thing for, we may have been the company of vice before, but now look how safe it is and how happy the children are to be drinking it. So it's this time, even after Prohibition, there were literally a handful of companies left. Weinhardt's was one of them. The Salem Brewers Association was another. There was one other, and the name is escaping me now. But there's nothing left. Like, it completely shuts down the industry for years. So Weinhardt continued to produce, not next to a church, but continued to produce, like I said, into the 1990s. It's not until the early 80s. This is Charles Corey, and he opened Cartwright Brewing in 1980. He'd owned a winery. He was a vintner. He was part of that early crew who started planting Pinot Noir grapes in Oregon. He had a winery up in the Forest Grove area, and his wife opened Cartwright Brewing. It was only around for 13 months, 14 months, and the beer he tried to bottle, and that's where it sort of fell apart because he was really, really inconsistent. There are pictures of his operation, and it's like, now he probably would be incredibly successful because people would be like, oh, it's farmhouse, this is great, it's so funky. But people did not think that when what they were drinking was still very, very yellow. But he's part of this kind of next generation of who comes later. So he opens in 1980 and closes very soon after. But people like the Widmers and Carl Ockert, actually I don't know if Carl Ockert, he was the brewer at Bridgeport. I don't know if he ever went, but the guys who established Portland Brewing went. And it really was exciting to people who had done European traveling. And so it was part of this, like, let's care about our food, let's think about stuff with flavor. His beer definitely had flavor. It was also more expensive, and so there was this, like, he was proof that people would pay $1 a bottle, which was a lot in 1980. This is one of the bottles of beer I was telling you that we have. One of the objects. This is the Cartwright Portland beer. It's the beer that's inside of the bottle. It's clearly not good anymore. It has not aged. In the last 40 years, it did not age well. It's very chunky inside, and I just hope nobody ever drops it. So yes, this bottle of beer became part of the archives. But it definitely, it sets up this stage for what comes. These are four of the early brewers, and it's a really exciting time for Oregon beer. The Bridgeport is down in the far left, and Bridgeport and Widmer and Portland Brewing, so that kind kind of L, they all opened within a few blocks of Henry Weinhardt's. It was an area that was zoned as industrial, so they could get buildings that had floor drains. So Bridgeport opened up in a rope factory. I'm not sure I think that the Widmers were in like what used to be a car dealership maybe, and the Portland Brewing guys opened up in a creamery. So they, along with people like the Widmer or the McMinimans, lobbied for something called the Brew Pub Bill, and this became really, really important, I think, as we were talking earlier about why is it that Oregon became Oregon, like what happened as far as Oregon beer goes, and why did that happen? And I think one of the big reasons it happened is this Brew Pub Bill, which was a bill that allowed, so wineries could serve the wine that they made on site, so they had tasting rooms. Brewers couldn't do that, so brewers couldn't sell and produce on the same site. So the Brew Pub Bill allowed them to do that. So they could have tap rooms, they could have restaurants, and it became a place where people could go. The Brew Pub Bill happens in 1985. Not everything changed, but certainly that 1985, it was pivotal. At the same time, while there were there was slow growth initially, so Rogue Ales opened, Full Sail Brewing opened, Deschutes opened kind of over the next 10 years. There's still a little brewery called Oregon Trail, and Oregon Trail opened in 1987, so the same year as Full Sail, and it's downtown here in Corvallis, and it's teeny, and like nothing has been updated since 1987, and it's like a step back into time, like it's like vertical, and so like everything literally goes, like gravity helps it all. It's just I love going there because it's so like how does this brewery still exist? They also are like absolutely the training ground for brewers. Like brewers usually don't stay longer than a year, so they've had something like 36 brewers and whatever, like 32 years, 33 years. But this is a time of great growth, and into the 1990s, there are lots of businesses that open. There are also lots of businesses that close. Something that starts to happen in the 1990s in Oregon is the growth in homebrew clubs, growth in organizations to support brewers. Fermentation program was not new. They'd certainly been doing fermentation research at OSU. But in 1995, a brewing science focus was, the fermentation science was officially established as a program at OSU. That's really critical in training brewers who are really qualified. So at the point that OSU started that program in 1995, the only other university program at that level, degree granting program, was at UC Davis. And so there just wasn't higher education programs that would be sort of start to finish teach you how to do this. And now they started a master's and PhD program that same year. So now they graduate. It's not a huge class, but I would say at any given time they probably have 15 or 20 graduate students.
It's just impressive. It makes sense now that why Oregon became such a big craft beer scene. With the bill. Yeah. Some states were still like 2010s. They still couldn't have people drink at their brewery.
Yeah.
So it's something I never knew.
And I think they're again this sort of like, I think of the land grant mission of an agricultural college, that we have scientists who are doing research on hops and then inviting people to field days. They still have field days. I went to one. It was very, very weird. I was like, I'm in history. Then same thing with the program, the fermentation science program here places graduates in really high-level, technical, large corporate breweries, but also trains people to run these small, local, and regional breweries. So I think it's all part of. I also want to know if we have more festivals than everyone else. I feel like there's so many festivals here. Not this year. That's one thing. Another one, I should be like writing down my all the things that I say in this interview that I want to do further research. The other thing I want to do further research on is the history of festivals, period. One of the students in the beer history class said, what do you know about the history of festivals? And I'm like, well, like where? Like here, or in Germany, or in South Africa? Like, yeah, so history of festivals. That's one that, yeah.
I would be interested in that too.
Yeah, and who they're marketed to. The Oregon Brewers Festival started in 1988, and this is the first year that it has not been held for all the obvious reasons. But there's also a festival of dark arts. There's a festival, the Holiday Ale Festival is another pretty popular one in Portland. There are organic beer festivals. There are home brewing beer festivals. When I first started the archive, as I said, I presented at lots of different places, including old people's homes. But I also tried to have booths at festivals, which was really awesome until I realized that people don't. So my first festival was the September Fest here, and I was in the education area, and so there were people next to me who were from the watershed department or something, and they started packing up, and I was like, why are they packing up? This is weird. We've only been here for 2 hours. There are 2 more hours. And then I realized that was the point the festival turned, and it was a place where people were drunk. So I was like, oh, yeah, that's why people come here. So I always packed up after 2 hours. I want to end by talking about Fred. And Fred Eckert is another one of those people who I was lucky enough to meet him, but I think he's another reason why Portland and Oregon are so known for beer. He was a home brewer, and he was an author, and he wrote about beer and wrote about style and wrote about taste. And he would write in the Oregonian newspaper. He also wrote for more traditional popular publications like All About Beer or Celebrator. He wrote books related to style and related to home brewing, and he really wanted people to taste beer. It wasn't he was not against fizzy yellow beer. I think he was all beer has its place, but he was really a translator. That was his job, was he did lots of work on food and beer pairings, did work with Rogue for a long time on the Chocolate and Beer Festival. So he was really, really into thinking about beer in the same way that people thought about wine. And we have his collection, and one of my favorite, he kept all these notes, which now I feel like, now that I have everything exist in the same place, I feel like, I should date all of my notes, because I really get mad that he didn't date all of his notes in his little notebook. But he would take notes on everything, and he would do stuff if he went to a wine and beer tasting, is one where he crossed out all the wines that they were recommended, and then recommending, and then wrote in the beers that he would like to have instead. So he's a character who was really important, I think, more generally in beer. So he was at the first Great American Beer Festival. There are pictures of him with Charlie Papazian hanging out. And he was just sort of a delightful, but also incredibly cranky and cantankerous person. He was very particular. When I did my oral history with him, we did it at a restaurant, and I picked him up because there were a couple other people who were going to co-interview him. And he told me how to drive. I'd never met him before, and he was telling me how to drive. And I was like, I'm driving Fred Eckert. It's probably fine. But I think he is set up beer journalism too. He's really important as somebody who made it possible for people to write about beer and to have it be something that is accessible and approachable and understandable, and that it was very community oriented. And I think he certainly gave people time and gave people space to think about beer as something more than just something to get drunk on. Yeah. So we have lots of collections. There's lots of history. And this is that I ended with. I cracked myself up. This was when I was like, this is the hard sell that I had. Yes, archivists want your stuff.
It's true.
It's true. Questions besides that? I kind of blazed through all of the craft stuff. So it's hard to really great lighting control here. shade. It's a hard history, I think, to tell concisely. I think there certainly is a lot of overlap. I feel like I'm learning more about the overlap, but it's a very different, Oregon is a very, very different place. And I will be curious to see kind of what survives out the other end of this. I think even before everything shut down several months ago, 3 months ago, the beer industry was struggling a bit, I think, to try to figure out, it for a while had been trying to be all things to all people, and do we now make hard soda? Do we now add CBD to stuff? Like, I think it was that kind of medium-sized Deschutes, and Widmer isn't really medium-sized, but Bridgeport, I think it was hard for them. It is hard for them to find their place in this.
Yeah, everyone keeps talking about how, I guess it's still going up, but everyone's predicting that the number of breweries are going to be going down soon. I mean, the pandemic's probably going to assist that, but it is going to be interesting to see how many last, because even during the pandemic, I still see some opening.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting.
It is really interesting. I just read, like, an hour before we started talking, there's a brewery downtown called Flattail, and they were, like, this is almost exactly their 10-year anniversary, and they were leasing the building, and the person who was leasing the building said, nope, your lease is now revoked, and so they're, like, out of business. I think hopefully they'll find a place to land, but I think rents are a big deal. I think cost of space is a big deal. I think the places that weren't reliant on restaurants will probably do a lot better. I think that's something that I've noticed, is that the businesses, even before the pandemic shut stuff down, the businesses that were really reliant on the restaurant and the food, that sometimes it seems like they tried, again, to be all things to all people. The restaurants were the things that closed. Yeah, I don't know. It's a hard time to be an archivist in a way. I'm not, like I said, this is my hard sell. I think it's hard to be in the midst of history happening. I think that is, even before the pandemic, that was what was happening. I think Portland still has more breweries, but it's expensive to live there. Yeah, it's expensive to live there. It's expensive to operate there. And I don't know that, I think areas like Southeast Oregon, I just think the tourism and the population, there aren't that many breweries, and I don't know that there ever will be. Like, I shouldn't say that, I have no idea. But, like, I think the people who are attracted to that area, the demographic of that area, I don't think, it's not Bend. Though Bend wasn't Bend 20 years ago either.
Right, I guess you can just never tell, like, where's the next great craft beer city.
I think there was this sort of interesting thing that was happening 3 or 4 years ago, where breweries were trying to open up, midway, so that there were the breweries that were opening up in North Carolina or Virginia, which I guess are not midway in my mind. This is like my total West Coast. Like, I don't know, everything, it's like the stuff over there. And I think that really overextended a lot of people. I think Deschutes is a great example. They tried to go into Roanoke, and the growth wasn't going to happen for them in the way that would make that a possibility, and then it kind of dilutes what you can focus on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when people do that. Like, New Belgium went down to Asheville, but I feel like people drink the beer because it's local, so you're trying to make it local now in multiple locations, which I think most people might catch on and just think you're just trying to make more money.
Yeah, which is sort of funny. It's like that Mason steam beer ad that I showed you, like that was not local, but they were kind of trying to pretend like they were local too, and like...
Yeah, so I guess they've been doing it for hundreds of years. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing the end result.